night, my daughter was throwing a fit about something. She's 3, and she'd gotten home at a kind of an ambiguous time of, is it snack time or is it nap time? And she does not want to take the nap, and she's hungry. So we give her a snack, and she starts throwing a fit about the color of the plate. And we're saying, well, this shows that you need a nap. No, I don't need a nap. Right. I'm not sleepy. This got her attention when I said, the fuss monster is very strong right now, isn't he?
You said the fuss monster.
Well, the fuss monster, this is not the first time that she's heard of the fuss monster. We use that as a metaphor all the time. You have to fight the fuss monster right now.
Fuss monster is strong.
The fuss monster is trying to get into your heart. And she's just falling apart trying to express what she wants with this plate, which was something we would have changed easily if she wasn't throwing a fit. It wasn't a big deal. She could hardly get the words out because the fuss monster was so strong. And I told her the fuss monster is very strong, isn't it? Yeah, and I held her hand. They use a nice voice, and she said, I can't. I said, well, do you know what that means? It means that you're sleepy. Do you know what the fuss monster eats? He eats sleepiness. And if you have a lot of sleepiness, the fuss monster gets stronger and stronger. All of a sudden, she wasn't fussing about taking a nap anymore. That made total sense to her.
She's how old?
She's 3. If you take a nap and you use up all the sleepiness, now the fuss monster gets all weak. And suddenly, I wasn't the bad guy for making her take a nap or for making her feel the way that she was, because she had a different explanation for why she felt this way.
It's the fuss monster.
It's the fuss monster and the sleepiness and that whole thing. Let's take care of that.
It's beautiful.
It was
good.
And so instead of spanking her for the fit, which she was being naughty, I was glad that I took the time to tell her about this tool of emotional control, this metaphor that would help her, because she responded to it so much more thoroughly than I expected. And then Leigh said she wanted to do this show about classical education, and classical education is really about absorbing tools of emotional control and intellectual. I mean, you could say intellectual control, but tools of thinking, we usually say. But I think it's tools of controlling your reactions and your emotions, too.
Because we all have the fuss monster.
We do.
And we always struggle with, should we eat or should we sleep?
Because should we
even grown-ups?
Oh, my goodness. I completely relate. You had me from the moment you started that story, because I wrestle with this even right now.
Really?
Can we be honest? I'm just being honest. Segue.
It's really tired.
Like when you're having an upset time yourself, is it easy to remember that that's because you're sleepy or hungry?
Well, now I'm going to think of it as the fuss monster strong inside me. Yeah.
Really good. Facing our own giants. Okay.
Face them unless you know they're there.
Right.
Yeah.
We got Chris Blackburn in the dungeon.
Hello.
With Jeremiah Wentz.
Hey.
And Tobin Doobie.
Is this a dungeon?
Thanks, guys. It's the nuclear bomb shelter. Yeah, we need to name it one day. Mm-hmm. So,
what could turn it into? What makes it a dungeon? Chains on the wall?
Well, I don't know.
I thought it was a dungeon just because it's in the basement.
It's in the ground.
It's all concrete.
The ceiling is made of stone.
Yeah, it's a pretty white and gray for those of you that can't see it. All right, well, I'm Leigh Bortins. Thanks for joining us. It's on, guys. So today we're talking about classical education, and I'd like our listeners to remember that the practicum season's coming up. The parent practicums or events Classical Conversations puts on in the summer, so that we can push away our modern education and replace it with classical education. Scriptures tell us if you get rid of one demon, it don't have something to replace it with, 7 more show up. And so the whole point of having parent practicums in the summer is so that when you say, yes, I do want to have a Christian classical education for our children, there's a place to come practice it. And what a beautiful thing it is. So we're not going to talk a lot about practicums, but that's one place you can come practice what we will be talking about today, which is classical education. So in trying to plan this, the one thing I was thinking about is Tobin's probably the most practiced classicalist that's your age that I know. I know a lot of PhD professors who've been at it 30, 40, 50 years. What drew you to the kind of education that you had? And tell our audience about your background in education. And then what do you see in transferring that to your own family?
Well, actually, I would say my homeschooling was classical, but we didn't know that word. My mom is a credentialed teacher. I was taught in the Christian school system for a long time before homeschooling me. And when classical education started to become a buzzword that reached our ears, she was excited about the movement, but as she looked at it, it was more like the education that she had actually received even in public school as a child, but that, of course, has been disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of having that word for it is something helpful, but didn't enter my life until actually college. And I went to Patrick Henry College, which is a I don't know what you call this anymore because we called it a Common Core curriculum. That has a different meaning now. But about half of the credits in your bachelor's there were common among all the students. You didn't start taking major specific courses until junior year. And those common courses were Aristotle, Kant, Western literature, Western philosophy, 3 semesters of theology, or we encountered Augustine and Aquinas. And it was, I always thought it was funny because our college attracted a lot of those articles from secular thinkers who were just motivated by hatred toward the Christian right. That kind of writer, you can spot it, saying that we only studied Christian stuff. And let me put down my Nietzsche and maybe write a response to this article.
We get that from CC all the time, too. It's either not Christian enough or too Christian.
Right. Classical education, received a classical education there that I draw on every day, even if only in the richness of the things I'm able to think about while I'm not working. And that's a benefit people don't talk about. Your mind becomes a nicer place to inhabit, I think, the more that you've read, the more you've put in, and the more that it is integrated.
That is really great. I just answered a Facebook question about why we make the children learn to listen in Foundations program with the classical music. And I didn't say that. I should have. Just learning to be still and think and hear things better. I mean, that's what the classical education is about. That's what human education is about. So before I let you finish the other part, I'm going to ask it again. I have some more questions for you. I'm going to ask Christopher and Jeremiah, why do you think I said that he's a classicalist? What is it about Tobin? What do you see in him?
Yeah.
It's okay if we talk about you looking on the room?
Well, I don't have a choice at this point.
I mean, obviously just knowing Tobin, I'm very aware of his interests in ancient literature, and he's orthodox. Like, what more do you want out of a classicalist than to go be orthodox and look at everything as larger than life? I don't know. Orthodoxy just seems like a very classical minded form of Christianity from a little bit of encountering that I've had with it. But I would say just from my encounters, I work with you every day and you approach every conversation on equal footing with the other person, no matter the context of the information you have. You're giving them the honor of the fact they might know something you don't. They might have this, something they've realized you don't quite see yet, even when it's something very stupid and I can look over your shoulder and go, no, they're just not thinking, Tobin. You're okay.
That's wonderful news.
Classical education breeds kindness, not elitism.
It's been a long journey to get to a point where someone would say that about my conversations.
Well, I mean, okay, right. So here's the thing about Tobin, and this completely makes sense with what you were saying, Leigh. But in Lost Tools of Learning, Dorothy Sayers says that the great problem with education is that it taught information, but it didn't actually teach people how to think. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing with Tobin is everything about him is let me examine it from all these different angles and come up with whatever I will make Jeremiah the most upset as our conversation seemed to go.
Some of my friends call it TMA, too much analysis.
Yeah, that's totally. But no, I mean, because you examine everything, and so in all of our conversations, it's great because you don't just take information from face value. You have to examine it, and you look at it, and you overturn every rock. And so we've had some great conversations because of that. Because you naturally have that classical model built in now.
And
you.
how does it
Yeah,
affect your wife when she just wants an answer?
Well, she was in a large homeschooling family, so everybody was talking at once anyway, and answers were delayed. So I benefit from that when I want to analyze things and talk about things for more time than maybe other people do, because that's true. I examine things. It's not that I have fewer presuppositions. It's just that when we're talking about any topic, I'll tend to try and go down to the fundamentals and build a definition of it. It's not always as deep as the context calls for.
What did you just say about fewer presuppositions? I wasn't following what you meant when you said that.
Well, I think it's part of classical education to. I mean, I have to come. You're pushing me to come up with a definition. Now, I'll just repeat what I said. I said that I don't think I have fewer presuppositions than anyone else,
Than other people.
But that I question them.
Okay.
That I think is the biggest distinction of classical education, is to be able to recognize: do you think something because you have good reasons for it, because you've taken it on someone's authority, or because it's just the cultural assumption of where you grew up and you've never examined it. And if you've never examined it, it's hard to you don't have a label on it that it's a thought you've never examined. You actually have to learn and practice tools to even discover that.
So with your awareness of this, I mean, just that fuss monster story is such a good example. What are the things that you think that help you transfer this information to your children? In other words, is there something that when you're around your kid, you think this is how I want to be, or this is the question for them, or is there something that, because I know in things that I want to get better at, I have to find some sort of trigger to remind me to act that way, or I fall back into my sinful nature.
Well, maybe I'm falling back into my sinful nature. I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Okay, so how do you approach it with your children then?
I practice asking them questions and trying to stretch them a little bit, sort of what we call being Socratic in CC. Because a 3-year-old can answer many questions about a thing. What color is it? How big is it? How different? In what way is this different than other things? What other things we've seen that are like this? We had a good conversation when Rose went outside recently and was upset. She noticed all the grass was brown. It's been
that should
brown.
bother her.
Been brown for a while, but it just hit her. And I said, well, that's just the grass that died in the winter. And if you look closely, there is also green grass. And she looked closely, and there it was. Is the green grass bigger, or is the brown grass bigger? The green grass is bigger. That's right. That's because it's new. And it's going to keep growing. And when it's not winter anymore, then it'll be the new grass. And then I asked her, what's the tallest grass you've ever seen? Because we were talking about grass can be different heights now. What's the tallest grass you've ever seen? And she said, bamboo.
Wow, at 3.
Wow.
That's impressive.
I said, you're right. You just taught me something.
Wow.
So I say that to say, those kind of questions of comparison and definition and circumstance. How old is this grass, or how old is this grass? It's circumstance. Those are the questions, the only questions to ask, but you have to be taught to ask them so that your questions aren't random. Right. And so modeling those questions is one of the most important things to teach a person, I think.
It's like, very Aristotelian. You have to go back and actually think about the order of things and what precedes this and what follows this and how do they relate. Those, the 5 common topics of how things are relating to one another, and knowing what to ask to get from one to another.
So besides the ones that you listed, there's also relationship and authority. Authority. Okay, so let's turn away from you for a second here. Jeremiah, you're the authority in your household with those kids of yours.
I am, yeah. I wear the daddy pants. Yes, I do. So we have 4 kids. ages from 3 to 12. And I was not classically educated. I was homeschooled. My parents started homeschooling back in 1983 with my oldest brother. And Leigh, you know this, it was kind of a wild, wild west at that point, homeschooling was. And so we never went through the trivium. You know, we talk about, I mean, let's go back to grammar for a moment. For those people who are listening who are maybe the first foray into classical education, it's basically the three phases of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And trivium is a Latin word that means where three roads meet. And so you have those classical educations. Let's focus on grammar, memorizing facts, and then analyzing the facts, and then communicating the facts. And so that's the classical model in a nutshell. And so I am looking at you guys all sitting around this table, and I kind of feel like, Leigh wrote the book on classical education. Tobin, of course, she calls the greatest classicalist of his generation, paraphrasing slightly. And then you have Chris, who is poster child for CC as well, right? And I was not, because you came up all through challenge and everything.
I did. I went through all of them.
Yeah.
Chris and William were the first two to do the entire program.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
So I'm a hot dog in a steakhouse. So my parents homeschooled, but I think like Tobin, like you said, there's a methodology that you can follow without knowing you're following it.
Yes.
And so my mom definitely had a lot of classical influence without saying, here, let's sit down and do this with intentionality to follow this trivium. So go ahead.
I was going to say, and why is that? Why is the classical model just what they did anyway?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm going to have to ask her that. But I think you just, because for years and years and years you recognize that this is the way people taught. And it wasn't until 120 years ago, maybe the late 1800s, that the progressive movement in education started. And so that's everyone says, "Oh yeah, we're attracted to this because it's new and it's flashy and it's the brightest and
right.
Technology is advancing, and so now we are smarter and better because of this." And I think my mom just kind of looked at it and said, "There's a problem with the mentality that says there's no problem that technology can't solve, even education." And so I think my mom looked at it and thought, we don't believe that all technological advancement is forward progress. And so there's when you pull it back to the central way that people taught for years, which is just asking questions, believing that the truth is inside you, Holy Spirit, we're creating the image of God. So we just continue asking questions, and the answer's there within you as you explore the world and relationship with Him. That's the way that she taught. So she was taught by asking a lot of questions and walking through the trivium on a much looser scale than doing it intentionally. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and it's worked for us.
I think so. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, we wanted to kind of mirror that, which is why when we found the classical conversations, we fell into it naturally because it's very much in line with the way that I was raised.
Right. Well, I'm really glad you brought up that thing because of following the trivium without having a name for it.
Right.
Because I feel like that's an area in which classical educators can appear elitist because they know these words that are like a secret knowledge that other people don't know how to access. And parents approaching homeschooling sometimes feel like they can't attain to classical education because it's hard and it's fancy, but it's actually just natural.
Yeah, one way you could say that is that education requires discernment, and it's not a formula.
Right.
Because formulas are easy and discernment is hard. And people shy away from things that are hard, and they want to plug into things that are easy. And classical education for us as a family provided answers and direction for that, for kind of channeling that discernment and fostering that, as opposed to saying, let's just do this formula.
And classical education isn't a formula, but it does provide helpful schemes, like knowing those 5 questions: comparison, definition, relationship, authority, and circumstance.
Right.
Those are the kinds of questions that can be asked. Once you know those 5 names, you can ask them with greater intentionality. But even not knowing the names, if you ask a good question, it's going to be one of those. It's sort of like an exercise routine or martial art. It's dictated by the way that your body actually works. Yeah. Once you know those forms and techniques, you're going to get you're going to condition your body much better.
Yeah.
But in any workout you're doing that works is falling into some kind of a discipline like that. Is that a good analogy? Maybe.
Sure, I like that.
Yeah, I didn't feel like I explained it.
No, that's good. What I like about that is you go back to this is the core. These are the basics. You learn the 5 common topics, and you learn how to apply this type of thing. And I think we like that because we're realizing now. As over the last 12 years of being a parent, and let's be honest, I mean, no one has any idea if you're doing a good job as a parent, right? Everybody's winging it, and at some point you say maybe 20 years from now I'll know whether it worked or not. Yeah. And that's it. You just do the best you can. You throw it into God's hands and say, I hope there's grace that covers the rest. But what we're realizing is that we are in this weird place in our culture where for thousands of years no parent ever encountered anything new. I mean, they didn't, right? So every parent throughout human history experienced the same issues and the same struggles, and they could go to other parents or other village elders and say, look, when you were in my situation, the exact same one, what did you do? And the problem is now as humanity, we can't do that anymore because for the first time in the history of the world, we have this generation of parents, our generation of parents, Tobin, who are facing things that no generation has ever faced before. So,
and the ones that people have faced before, we don't ask our elders, we ask the internet.
We ask the internet, right? Because the elders don't have any answers for that. Because I can't go to another parent and say, look, how did you handle, social media, online bullying when we were kids? Because there's no framework for that. It didn't exist. So with the classical education, what we like about it, and Tobin, I think this was good with what you said, is that it teaches you as parents, as much as your kids, the importance of making good decisions based on the foundations of truth, goodness, and beauty, right? Let's ask these 5 questions. That's how you evaluate life. Like what is the EA video games, right? Challenge everything. It gives you a framework by which you can judge the answers that come up when you challenge things.
Mm.
Sounds good. So I wanted to ask Chris if he could... since he was in classical conversations, if he could give us, I don't know, any kind of analysis looking backwards now that you've been out of it for 5-6 years, and how was it formative for you?
Was it? Well, of course. I mean, that was my formation was in classical education, and now thinking about it, because we've been talking about classical education now for a while. And before I answer this, I kind of bounce back to you guys and say, what are the distinctives? What are the things that make classical education different than just educating?
They read Latin.
Read Latin?
No.
Right. And so that's that part that seems elitist, right? People think it's Latin literature, the ancients, and that's not a classical education. That's the content of a classical education. It's not the methodology or the goal of a classical education. So.
And I'm going to throw a plug in here real quick. There's a video that's on the Classical Conversations YouTube channel that Tobin and his team put together, and it is absolutely so stupid good about how important Latin is to learn and how it's a foundation for so many things. Because we can toss around, oh yeah, it's important to learn Latin, but I've never seen anyone do a better job of packing into like 5 or 7 minutes in an entertaining format why Latin is really important. So I'd encourage every listener to go to the YouTube channel and find that and check that out.
Do you know what it's called so they can find it, Tobin?
It's called 3 Reasons to Study Latin for Normal People, Not Language Geeks.
Yeah, it's funny when you sent me the draft of that. I remember thinking like, wow, you've been sitting on this for a while. You had a lot of very well developed thoughts on that topic.
I kind of had. Well, because of the whole. And those thoughts are triggered by the whole elitist thing. Yeah. When people talk about why to study Latin, well, it's because it was studied for thousands of years. It was studied by all of these important people.
That's a fact. That's not a reason.
Those are who cares?
And that's kind of what I'm getting at when people mention like, what is classical education? The first thing you think is, oh, you study Socrates and Aristotle, and you've got Oedipus, and it's a lot of larger, lofty, big, kind of just in your face ideas that don't seem communicable. They don't feel relatable.
Right. You're going to get together with your yacht club friends and make references while you're drinking champagne. It's not going to use it in the real world.
And so that's why
you said all your yacht club friends.
Right?
Do you have those, Tobin?
No, I don't.
That's funny.
How do you know that's what they do then?
How many pairs of boat shoes do you own?
I feel like that's the perception. That's the perception of people who've read Socrates. You know.
That's funny.
The distinctives, I think it's hard to put put a definition to this because words are so finite and words are so limiting. But
Right.
but what would I say are the distinctives of classical education is sort of an epistemological caution.
Oof.
Epistemological meaning how we know things. Be cautious about what you know, because you don't always know the difference between what you know and what you think you know. Classical education gives you the tools to discern, okay, what are the things you only think you know? And then to pick those apart and say, what's the layer underneath that I do know?
Right.
And how can I build on that by asking the right questions and arrive at the truth?
Because it's not just sophistry. It's not just a rejection entirely of dogma where you don't know anything and you're just going to go and look at the world and make arguments until you've lost your mind. You have an underpinning of your worldview, some idea that you hold on to and you judge everything from. So I think that's the thing. I really liked earlier when you said, it gives you a set of schemes from which to analyze the world.
Yeah. We don't I feel like the modern world doesn't use the word scheme in the way that I mean it. And when I encountered this word in college, studying child development, it was a very helpful word. You notice in the movie WALL-E, if you've seen this movie, that Pixar didn't even try to do a story that was as grand as this one. The next time they went with a humbler, also good story, but it was good because it was of humbler material. But anyway, in WALL-E is this robot who was built to compact trash. And after doing this for a long time, he's begun to notice the beauty in the world, and he keeps things in his little trailer. And one of the things that happens when he unpacks the things for the day, and we see that this is his life, and he has a cup of spoons and a cup of forks. And today he has found in the trash a spork, and goes to hold it up to place it with the spoons, and sees that it's not right. Goes to place it with the forks, and that's not right either. And his little robot arm goes back and forth between the two until he realizes this is a new category of thing. That's what I mean by scheme. A scheme is a category in the world of plastic cutlery. there are not 2 but 3 categories, and actually maybe more if he found more. Well, when he finds more of those, if he were to find more pieces of cutlery out there, he would add them to the scheme.
Right, and even begin to define into the scheme itself.
Right.
Is this plastic? Is it metal?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's a lot to go into that, and it's branching a scheme. It's about ordering, again, back to Aristotle, and asking the questions of where does it go in my understanding of the world.
Yes. Category. Understanding, not just having categories, but having the questions that help you understand the categories into which you can sort your experience.
Right.
So can I bring in then to the conversation, how do the questions change or affect your intellectual abilities when you have a copious vocabulary?
Oh, well.
And that would relate to memory work and the repetition that we emphasize also.
Every new word you learn enables you to have more thoughts, but you will always have more thoughts than you have words to express them. And that is the thing I'm learning with my 1-year-old is she has so few words. She doesn't know how, she doesn't have the interrogative mood. She doesn't know how to ask a question. So she just states it the same as the declaratory mood. Those moods are voices. Maybe someone's going to write a comment. Some language geek out there is going to write a comment that I got.
They already turned it off back when you insulted them earlier.
They did. But that's been a wonderful thing to observe, where she'll be frustrated by not having a word, and we just try to calm her and intuit what it is that she's asking for, and use that moment to teach that word, because she's not being naughty. She's getting angry because she doesn't possess the word to express her thought, and that's a painful situation.
So imagine how it is if you're a young adult male among a bunch of other young adult males who can't find employment and can't find cultural acceptance, and they're getting frustrated and angry because they don't have the words they need. Leads to war and terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is why, again, classical education is just, it's so important that we give people these tools of thinking.
Yeah.
Because it gives you a harness for your emotions, right? It gives you a gauge for your thoughts and how to limit your own reaction to things.
Mm-hmm. Maybe this isn't a distinctive of classical education, but it's a scheme I can give you that will tell you what I think classical education is, and maybe answer your question that way, Chris. Is I think you could draw a spectrum, and on one side is a savage, and on the other side is the classically educated man or woman, and we all fall somewhere in between there. But that would be one way to define it. Classical education is the opposite of being a savage. Savages react with violence when they don't understand things.
Mm-hmm.
They react with violence when something is displeasing or alien.
And when you're saying savage, you're not thinking of someone my age's image would come up to somebody in the middle of some jungle, primitive kind of people. You're meaning just their personality is savage wherever they are. Anybody could be anywhere and be that way.
Often people living in the jungle or in the desert behave that way because they haven't had the civilization or the heritage to teach them the schemes for sorting their experiences. But you can act that way anywhere. Yes,
these are societally learned things, how to behave in society, because it's a safety thing.
Mm-hmm. I had it the other day. I told you, Chris, when I went to take a picture of take a video of what my children were doing with these wonderful cameras we all have in our pockets now. And when the camera is on the lock screen so that you can open it and take a picture of your children right now. You don't need to push more than one thing. Well, it had updated itself in the night, which led it to, when I opened the camera, it asked me, do you want to complete this action using Snapchat or your camera? I want to take a picture now. Don't
make me wait.
I had and then the kids weren't doing the thing anymore, and I missed it. But I had a savage reaction to something that was unpredicted. I didn't expect it to happen, and it was in my way. Mm-hmm. So my fleshly reaction is to destroy that thing so that I can get back to what I wanted to do, and the world will make sense. And I think that's where violence comes from. I don't think you have to talk about sin as in any kind of
frustration.
Yeah, it's just frustration. People are led to violence by not understanding the world a lot of times.
Mm-hmm. So as the developer of this curriculum, one of the places I get pushback is in the regularity of so many of the things that we study, and like all of the timelines, the same one for 6 years, and we do essentials for 3 years, and Henley Latin for 3 years, and you just addressed why we do that. It's a horrible thing for a child to be frustrated because they don't know what's coming next, and they don't have experience to even guess well what's coming next. And so they learn best if they can say, okay, it's the same. I can do this again. I can do this again. Right. And so it's a really important part of the classical model, and why your mom naturally did it. She loved you, and she knew you needed to be told more times maybe than your sister needed to be on something, but that the repetition is what made it so that now you say thank you, or you can control yourself.
Oh yeah, thank you. Your children aren't grateful the first 1,000 times they say thank you.
But we say it to them, right? They say it so that one day when they have that feeling, they know the right words to use.
That's true. And my mom was also a child psych major in college, so a lot of it made sense looking back. Leigh, I'd like to hear more about you because a lot of people, they see classical conversations, a lot of them view it as this large company now, which has certainly grown into, and has the abilities and the resources to help so many parents out there now. However, it didn't start that way. And you started, I want you to just share, if you could, your desire for not just homeschooling, but to do it in the classical model. What were some of your motivations for that? Back when it was just, there wasn't a big company. It was just you and your kids.
So I was fortunate that I personally was a voracious reader from an early age, and I was one of those 10% of people you could have stuck in a cave and I would have come out knowing calculus. It was just how I am. I'm adamant about words and ideas. But I was raising 4 young men, and I didn't understand at first why they weren't reading at 4. Right. Eventually, I realized, okay, that's not normal. So, so there's a lot of learning on my part to do. And when we got to the high school level, by then they were, it was Robert in particular, was reading very, very well. But I noticed that he still didn't have the vocabulary I had, and he couldn't just pick up the Federalist Papers and read it, because that's not the kind of reading we were doing as a family. We were reading great stuff, but not that real difficult level that the classicalists would read. So the challenge hadn't been there. So it was hard to read the Constitution. It was hard to read Shakespeare. So with our in putting the curriculum together, I was like, okay, so there's this lack, and the lack is in discussing ideas and making these words your own. And so to meet once a week with other kids with the same material made it more interesting than just always talking to mom about these things. So that's kind of how it all played out. And then myself and Christopher's mom and a few other moms that were in it originally started having more babies. And we looked at the babies and said, okay, we know what we did, what was inadequate about the education for the older set that we have. And so we really, because we poo-pooed, because modernity does it, we said, you don't need to memorize, you can look it up.
Right.
And we realized that was our number one reason they didn't have copious vocabularies, is they hadn't memorized. So we said, you know what, you are going to memorize a timeline, you are going to memorize Latin declensions. We're just going to go through this list of things that geography, planet doesn't change. Why don't you know the name of everything on it? And it was just really instrumental in that other parents started to recognize that that's what was lacking in their education. And so they started to join the Foundations program more than the Challenge program. And then unfortunately, over the years, it's continued, and there's lots in Challenge also. So I just knew that everybody has within them the ability to expand their vocabulary, but most of us stop at 5th grade. And that's what I wanted to stop from stop happening, among other things.
Good.
That's I like that you said that about geography, because that's another distinctive of classical education is the ability to absorb vocabulary and to understand sets of items. Because the reason to memorize everything on the planet isn't so you can draw it or say the names of all the countries, even though our students do that, and it's very impressive. I would suggest the reason for that is so that when they encounter some new field in college or in graduate school, that they're able to absorb those terms that only very few people on the planet know. And they can become doctors or lawyers, whatever career.
Specific dialect.
Yeah, career that has a specific dialect I was looking for. But even a field that is new, when something new is discovered, and nobody knows anything about it, and you can't look it up, you can use the
You have a framework for the revelation.
Your brain is used to memorizing long lists of things. That's the skill you need to do. Don't cut it up into countries. You cut it up into whatever it is in this new area.
That's kind of what you were saying earlier about the going through and how hard it is on a child to have to be reintroduced to new things every single time. Whereas you can teach them, the same thing, and then they revisit it later, and I know where we're going next. But it wasn't just the same thing. You're adding in more information. I went through the timeline cards, I don't even know how many times as a kid. And the first couple times, I probably just knew the names of the timeline cards. I just knew the bare sequence of events. But then as I got older, my mom would read them to me, and more of the surrounding information would be retained, and I'd make connections between other things we're doing. And so I'm unveiling this world that's being painted before me as I'm receiving this information. So I'm kind of building a greater picture of this tapestry that is the history, and so it's not just it's like a single you're learning this one set of information. But by knowing that, I tie in all these other things throughout and continue to build upon that and learn more about it and grow that.
It would be interesting. I wonder if anybody's studied this, but does a highly educated brain versus an uneducated brain, when they both suffer memory loss, I'm curious to know whether the ability to memorize sets and to integrate sets of things is actually a memory, or is it a physical feature that we're building? It'd be interesting to.
There's lots of
see.
shows on brain plasticity that address that. They do research, a lot on that. I don't know the exact answer to what you're asking about the physical nature versus the memory part of it, but
It'd be tough to find volunteers for that study, wouldn't it?
Well, after they've had their memory.
I see. Okay, got it. Afterward.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see if they
got you.
learn
Yeah.
to talk more quickly or whatever.
Yeah. Here's a question. Because it's easy for us, we obviously recognize that we are in a bit of a bubble here, and one of the great things about classical education is it teaches you to be accepting and inquisitive of the other side. So, what are some of the downfalls of classical education? Are there any? Like classical education, if maybe as we hear back from parents, some of the problems that they're struggling with, what are some things that maybe parents listening at home can say, here, this is something that I want to classically educate my child. What are some things I need to be aware of? Could be a potential negative side effect that I need to steward as a parent.
I think I got you right here.
Yeah?
Your kids might get arrogant because they think they're being taught better than everyone else. But the classical education that you're giving them gives them a framework for how to deal with individuals. So even though, and I know this from myself, that I was very pompous, 14-year-old.
I still liked you.
That I thought I knew everything, and I was willing to debate and argue with everyone to the end of the earth. I remember the first time I met Matt Bianco, and I found out he didn't like Abraham Lincoln for various issues. And I was like, how can you not like Abraham Lincoln? And I just followed him around and asked him questions. He thought I was very annoying, but he was also condescended and answered my questions, and now I'm great friends with him. So the classical education that I was receiving, knowing that I was receiving this education that was different than everything else, made me think like, oh, I must be smarter than everyone else. I must be more intelligent than everyone else. But because of the education that I was receiving, I was being given the framework for how to deal with individuals in a way that honors them, in a way that is by nature exhibiting humility. So even though like my heart was in the right place, my education redeemed my heart into a place where I was able to actually have conversations with people and give them that honor, to respect their ideas.
And on the other hand, there is on the other side, there is such a thing as not being aware that you have been given better tools than other people. And so that's a different kind of debate. Overly debating somebody is debating somebody on an issue that they actually don't have the tools to see, or that they're afraid to step outside of their box because they don't have a tool for getting out. Questioning whether whatever narratives they've believed, whether it be their political party or their picture somebody who's been part of a cult. You're not going to just blast them with church history and with all of these facts because they don't have the framework to absorb it. They maybe been actually brainwashed. In a sense, to be educated without the tools of classical education is to be brainwashed. There are certain thoughts you can't have. And those of us who have the tools to suddenly have those thoughts want everybody else to have them too. But it can't just be told it has to be built. And that's a bad debate I've gotten into, where there's things, well, I was homeschooled and went to a classical school for 5 years, and I have all these discussions with my classically minded friends. Why can't you see this? I'm telling it to you. You have to understand the things that have shaped your ability to have this thought.
And I think about aggression in conversation when people get to really heated argument over Thanksgiving dinner because half the family is, okay, they voted for this president you don't like. And so now everybody's got this real big frustration, and there's this tension in the room, and people are angry, and they're trying to convey their ideas, but they don't understand the policies that they're talking about well enough to convey them. And so they just get angrier and talk louder about this, and they repeat the same things. So there's no conversation happening. And so from my experience, when people are more educated on topics, they're able to have more nuanced conversations, and they don't get as angry. They get more passionate when they're finding themselves stifled in their ability to express the frustration that they see. Mm-hmm. That's a very frustrating feeling. So the frustration is more internal than it is external. And so that's where classical education, I think, helps you to know where your limitations and knowledge are.
Having a nuanced understanding of exactly what's bothering you, knowing exactly what bothers you about illegal immigration illegal immigrants being here. Because if you don't know what that is, then you could just sound racist, or you could just say something that's actually false. They're taking the jobs, and somebody might be able to show you that's not happening. You have a nuanced understanding of it. Yeah, that's very valuable.
So you're making me think. I want to throw in this. There's just an obvious result of the lack of a classical education over the last 60 years, and that is not just the reduced vocabulary of people under 50 now, but how many people they use slang so much. They have to throw the F word in all the time because they don't know the right word to say. One of the things I really enjoyed was when my kids were growing up, we'd watch the Waltons. And if you remember, there was the two Baldwin sisters. Listen to those two women talk when they would chew out Grandpa. They could break that man down without, breaking a sweat or saying a single swear word because they had such a great vocabulary and they were very clear about what was upsetting them. Right? And so if you think, modern education is just fine, go hang out with a bunch of 20-year-olds and listen to the 7 or 8 words they say over and over again.
That's interesting because when you hear someone communicate their ideas, and they're obviously well thought out, and they communicate it. The Bible talks about truth and love. Then you have tremendous respect for that. And you're right, a lot of people don't know how to do that. I think that someone asked me a while ago, how come I don't cuss? Because I don't swear. And I said, there's because people go back and forth on scriptural backing for it, and I understand different interpretations. Okay, for me, I've never seen anyone cuss and go, man, the fact that they use that language made me respect them more. You know what I mean?
No, it's always
never.
degrading.
It's always the opposite. If you see someone swear, then you always think, oh, that either my opinion is neutral, the same as it was, or I've lowered my respect level for them because they're using that language, right? But the opposite is if you're classically educated and you have a bigger vocabulary and you know how to communicate your ideas without resorting to that type of language, if you hear someone do that, your respect for them immensely improves.
So here's another pitfall of classical education is I hang around people who are coarse, who my mother would call foul-mouthed. I say that they have coarse thoughts in that their thoughts are not refined, and so their words are coarse. We use coarse as if it is something evil. It just means that it's not refined.
Sure.
I hang out with people who swear. I'm not put off by it. I wouldn't say that I pity it. But it's a situation that's undesirable that is hurting them, and I'm less bothered by it than like my parents would be. So that's kind of a pitfall. But I see that as sort of being culturally flexible.
Right. So that's where I want to contend because my entire generation, it's our vernacular.
It kind of is now.
I don't bat an eye. You can say anything except retarded, and like the infamous N-word.
Yes.
And anything else is it doesn't matter. It's just part of the vernacular of my generation, and it's just what I'm used to hearing.
I would say that was okay, Christopher, if they also used other words.
Right.
When they felt that way.
That's the thing. I think it's symptomological. I don't think that's the actual issue at hand, is that they're swearing. I think it's a symptom of a greater issue, which is a lack of ability to express yourself clearly.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I came out of the auto industry and working around mechanics and car salesmen for about 10 years. And so I was certainly around it. And there's some, you're right, culturally, sometimes in context, it bothers you less than others.
Sure.
Like if you watch, if you were to watch, let's say, a movie about let's say, for example, a hip hop artist in Detroit, growing up in Detroit, right? He was on the streets. Then there would be, if hypothetically they made a movie about that person, if hypothetically I would happen to see it, then if they did it without language, then you would be off put in your mind. You say that's not culture. That's not. It's like Nazi speaking English instead of German, right? I mean, no, subtitle that for me. Otherwise, I have a disconnect.
You only watch subtitled
But part of it too is
films?
I love subtitle movies, and I think subtitle movies. Well, let me say this.
No,
first.
I don't think you said you love subtitles movies. I think you said you're a snob about it.
Oh, we're going back to a podcast. Well, part of it too is let's talk about this. I mean, part of the reason I never really cussed too much, although I went through a phase where I tried, is because I was never very good at it.
It's an art.
I mean, there's an art. Some people it's like poetry, and you go, oh man, that sounds good. And then you do it and you're like, no, I guess I'm just not good at that.
The people that are good
Right?
at swearing, they actually have a good vocabulary. They're like Eminem, and they understand how to use adjectives. And so instead of using the swear words as their adjectives, they dress their swear words.
So Eminem said he used to study the dictionary because he said the more words, Lee, like you were saying, the bigger his vocabulary. He said I could just pull them out any time. Yeah. He did a fascinating interview with Anderson Cooper where he talks about how, yes, you can rhyme with orange. It depends on how you do it. And here's 8 examples of that. And I know these.
It's my orange 4-inch door hinge.
Yeah,
George.
My Uncle George. Yeah, it's bizarre, but he said he studied the dictionary because he wanted to get all those words because he knew there was power in the language that he had. Let me go back real quick, Tobin, because you ripped me on that on the subtitles.
Yeah, I did.
I would say this: I've always liked subtitled movies, and I love the fact that they're becoming more popular. And I hate to do this, but I have to credit Facebook with that because people are online and they're looking at their Facebook feeds and they're scrolling through videos when they're standing in line at the supermarket, and they don't want the volume on. They just want to scroll through and see the subtitles there. And I think that's, without thinking, opened them up to a whole new genre of films where they watch subtitled movies that they weren't open to before subtitles became an everyday part of their life.
Well, subtitles are almost like a language that you speak, right? It's different than listening to a movie. It's not really a language, but it's a different linguistic mode. Yeah. So it's a good one to have.
Or you can become old like my husband and I, and we even watch English movies with English subtitles because we can't hear them anymore.
I'll tell you, we have the subtitles on with our kids sometimes
so
because it helps them read. Yeah, it does. It helps them reading. But
it's how people who come here from the country and they're not able to learn it.
Well, the first time I watched the classic, cinematic achievement, that was "Dude, Where's My Car?"
Oh, yes.
It was a Japanese overdub audio with English subtitles on it. So I'm seeing their lips move. I'm seeing the Japanese audio over top of it, and then I was reading the subtitles. We're way off base. Let me try and bring it back. Heather Shirley, who is one of the leaders here at Classical Conversation, she made a great point, I thought, during a meeting a couple weeks ago, where she said that we exist in a society where we are pushed away from other people and we're pushed toward machines. That's just the society that we live in. We become exclusionary and we focus on the flickering pixels because that's what attracts us, and we move away from authentic community, which is why I think the center of Classical Conversations built around the community is important, and the importance of face-to-face. And I think that one of the reasons my wife and I decided to not just homeschool but homeschool classically is because we recognize the importance of that face-to-face, that community, and asking the questions that arise out of that, those different viewpoints where you do ask the questions. Because there were a whole lot of flashy, brand new homeschooling models out there where we could just kind of sit our kid in front of a computer all day and they would complete all the coursework. But that wasn't the goal for our family. Right? Like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, just wave your hand and you have this broom, this tool, which will do all the work for you. The tool is all you need. It doesn't require anything from you anymore.
Love that you brought that up because even though that was necromancy, it is a parable about technology.
Well, Mickey's Clubhouse, he waves the magic words and all of a sudden his clubhouse appears. I mean, if you want to go there, the occult is all around us. It just depends.
Well, the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice isn't always a broom. It appears throughout folklore and sometimes is an actual devil that when you summon it, it demands a task. And,
but what does it do?
You don't know the words to make it stop doing the task.
I like that. And here's the thing. We're attracted to that because it promises ease.
Yes.
Ease everywhere. Remove the problems. And we just think, with the classical model, there's a better way. And easy isn't always better. And even though it's easy to sit and do this, sit in the classroom and just go through this, here's my tool bucket for history. Here's my tool bucket for language. Here's my tool bucket or my bucket for math or whatever. We do things that are difficult because they make us better people.
Yeah.
I can't help but think about Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle is the Way, which is, it's just a treatise, I guess, on how to be not Socratic, but stoic.
Or stoic.
How to be stoic.
Stoics have some good ideas.
So another thing that I would say is a pitfall is parents of about 6th graders who've been doing the classical model for a while can tend to get bored because they're ready to move on to the dialectic, but their child isn't necessarily ready. And so they impose their sense of just curiosity and questioning on a child that's still, just like Andrew Pudawa says, just wants to get their memory work done, read the books they need to do a few math problems, and go play. And there's not a thing wrong with that child. You can't make them dialectic before the Lord's going to have them, think that way. And so just a caution to parents to not feel like you failed, your child failed, or the curriculum failed if you're not seeing the same results. Pretty much before 17 years old. I mean, after 17, you start to see a little bit more stability on the rhetoric and the dialectic side. But some people just take quite a while before they can fathom how to pull together a lot of ideas. And the worst thing, I think, for a child like that would be for you to give up and then send them to a school that's just going to feed them with more grammar, and it's not your grammar. It's things that are anti-Christ, and anti-family.
But you're saying, that's interesting. I'm going to go back to that real quick and ask you to maybe expound on that a little bit more. You're saying that up until age 17, there's a couple year difference in where people are, but it all evens out in time if you stick with the model.
Well, and I think in general, a lot of brain study stuff have shown that really at 25, even men and women are pretty much all similar as far as their thinking abilities. So somewhere between that 11-year-old who just could go run a big corporation and the middle 20s, it's like in sports too. Everyone's a phenom till they're 18. Right. Then everybody can do that. So so because we have this scope and sequence that's laid out that's intended to be rigorous on the not just the conversation side, but also on the way we haven't talked about too much the rhetoric side, the presenting. You were talking about it more in a negative light, in that it prevents frustration. But we're trying to encourage people to debate, to write persuasive essays. Some of those students aren't ready yet, and just give them time. And so the parents will say, well, then they're not doing their work, or I don't know how to get them to do the work. And one of the things that you should do for anybody that's new at anything or still struggling is don't give up. Don't change that work. The expectations be similar. Just do less of it. So for instance, your 13-year-old who just still cringes when it comes to writing, don't make them write the 5-paragraph essay. Make them write 5 sentences, right? And then that's what they present in class. So at least they're still focused on the same activity and the same practicing as their peers are, so that when they get to class, they can participate and they can enjoy the conversation.
That's interesting, because I asked right before we came down here, I was walking out and I saw Robert Bortins, the CEO of the company, asked him and said, hey, we're about to do this podcast. What's your words of wisdom? What do you have to bring up here? And he said, honestly, relax. Don't sweat it. He says the system works, so, work the system. That's the cliche, but it's true. He said, just relax, because it works if you teach them the basics and then hold their hand and walk them through it. So that was really good.
Yeah, and another thing we don't do very well because of how modern education has trained us is we're not always aware of the stages of learning with our children, and that's what the classical education really helps with. And so an example I'll give is the very best of parents and the worst of parents will throw a 3, 4, 5-year-old on their lap and go slowly with phonics. They just know that's the only way that child needs to practice and will practice. It's a one-on-one kind of thing. Well, your 12 to 13-year-old needs to sit by you sometimes and go step by step through a math problem or step by step through a hard paragraph in a document. The same way you have to practice connecting visual symbols with sounds, you have to practice a series of words with sentences and complete thoughts. And we don't always give our children in that 11 to 15-year-old range, when that's the best time to practice that, enough attention. Now, that doesn't always mean sitting next to them in a schoolish situation. What you're talking about earlier, Toe, about asking questions. So car school, or throwing the basketball around and coming up with around the world kind of questions and things like that. All that encourages the student in those skills. But some of them just need time, I guess is what I
I really like what you said there about how, we're a lot of times one-on-one with the smaller kids, but we don't do it when they get older. And we kind of, the progressive education course is focused on group learning, right? And everybody who's been any part of a group project or anything knows group learning favors the extroverts, and it's a difficult thing. But if you pull out of education from that sense, in every important area of life, group learning doesn't work. Like, they don't give group driver's licenses out. You know, it's an individual thing. You sit down one-on-one with somebody, okay? I mean, it doesn't work as a group. You know, you handle the steering wheel, you push the gas pedal, and you're in charge of the brake. Just wait until the person who's the navigator tells you hit it, and then you do it. You can't do that as a group because when it's important, we sit down with people one-on-one. Yeah. So why don't we do that with education? Yeah. So I like the idea that's important to make sure we should.
Money and personnel is why we don't.
And that's why, I mean, CC, I got pressed in the early years a lot to go to 2- and 3-day programs. And I kept saying, no, they need the group experience one day out of the week because I know they're also in our network of people getting church the second day of the week. And then most of them have some sort of art, music, or sports. So they're getting a third time a week. They need to be quiet. They need to have just mom and dad patting them on the back. And that's another thing that I'm a big proponent of. It depends on your family. Every family is different, but my family always responded to touch. If they were super frustrated about something, all I had to do was put my hand on their back and peace and calm would, come around. Other people, no, they need to walk around the room, all right? There's different things for different, they need to go eat, whatever that is. And that's what makes homeschooling so unique compared to group schooling is that you can get to know the child so well. You can go, okay, that hangry, that frustration, it's coming. And you can learn for each child how to deal with the frustration monster.
Fuss monster,
the fuss monster. Yeah, that's better than frustration monster.
It's quicker to say.
It's good. So, I mean, I don't know that there's school teacher training in you've got 15 kids in front of you. Which ones are you going to touch and not touch? I'm pretty sure they're not allowed to touch any of them anymore. Right? Which ones of them are you going to say, hey, go run around the gym for 4 minutes and come back? Well, they're in trouble.
Yeah.
Right? So when people bring school home, that's the whole thing they're missing. And when people think homeschooling is just bringing books home, they forget, no, it's about the whole body and the whole person. So we have a lot of material. We have a lot of high standards. We have a lot of activities. But I've never said they were anything but a guide that we give you with a tutor. The words that we purposely chose are very different than a school situation because you've got to adapt it for that individual. And yet we do live in community. So that's what I was saying earlier. Do a little less if it's too hard, but don't do nothing. Respect the people you're going to be with and come prepared enough to participate with them. That's been the hardest thing I think about the whole challenge program is parents wanting to do the entire canon of rhetoric every year for every assignment. And because classical education looks really different in high school compared to modern education. So, for example, a lot of parents will look at our American documents, and they'll want to know, my kid's going to come out of here and they didn't really get a civics lesson, or they don't really know American political history. And I'm like, that's right. That wasn't the point of that class. The point of that class was for 14-year-olds to practice reading only difficult documents that have formed our entire culture. And if they can just read it and tell you back some of what it said, they're so much more advanced than their peers are going to be because they worked with difficult material they're not interested in and figured out a way to make it interesting versus, writing that essay and checking off 4 multiple choice questions kind of thing. So we have essay courses, but we also have just plain old, can you read it and tell me back what it says courses? And that makes parents, they don't know what category to put that in.
Well, I think it's because they're seeking a formula, right? Don't you think that's people's inclination is to, what do I do to make the result happen? Yeah. And as you were pointing out, the result maybe doesn't show up for years.
Yeah, like we said earlier, formulas are easy. Discernment is hard. Being an active, involved parent is difficult.
Now, here is another pitfall of classical education is that your child there are going to be formulas that you maybe rely on that your child will see through as being formulas and then question them and ask very frustrating questions.
They can be rebellious or cynical because they recognize this is not really, what it's not demanding anything of me. It's a waste of time.
Well, I think that's what teenagers realize anyway. That's why they're so jaded and cynical and
it's natural personality.
Right, because they realize that everything is fake in some sense or a construct. I won't say what they call it. Everything is because we talked about why swear words might fit in a vocabulary, but not on this podcast. But kids get cynical about everything being just put on and not being real. And I think when that happens for classical students, that they have more developed reasons for it. For example, I don't go to church where my parents go to church. I don't vote for the party that my parents vote for. And that wasn't very difficult conversations with my mom because she's an educator. She was aware that she taught me certain points of morality, which I now think I now uphold with my vote in a different way than she thinks is right to do. And so that's fine between us. But that's a thing that probably will happen with a classically educated child. I would expect you've raised more classically educated children than I have, Leigh, but that was my experience as the child. Is I still believe in all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
I think
the manifestation might be different.
I think such and such a political movement isn't the best way to support those, and I'm going to vote for something else. Or I think such and such a church institution isn't the place where those things are best celebrated, and I'm going to go somewhere else.
You're saying that your mom was okay with that because you had well-developed reasons for it, and it wasn't just making this decision out of rebellion.
Oh, right. So it cuts both ways. A child having good reasons for rejecting those could be very frustrating, but it shouldn't be, probably.
The other thing that's making me think about, I was raising these grown boys that I have is, you raise brothers and sisters. You don't raise children. That's what they become. And so as they became my brothers, I had to speak to them differently. Sure, every now and then I'm still their mother and I say, knock it off, right, to them. But if it's something that they're feeling like maybe a conflict that you might have had with your mom, I have gotten to the point where I've just listened to them and pray, and the Lord normally will give me something that reaches into their heart so that we can continue to disagree, yet they know I'm on their side.
Yeah.
And they know that maybe I should listen to Mom. She didn't just belittle me or push me over. She actually asked me a question that I hadn't thought about before. And so I just found the classical model helps me as a parent. It just irks me when parents will say, well, my kids are grown, they're going to make their own choices. And I'm like, that just sounds ridiculous to me, because everyone, when they make a choice, is actually making somebody else's choice. There's not a new idea under the sun. So if they didn't get it from me, they got it from somebody else. They didn't think of all this stuff on their own. And why would I not want, through their adult years, while they're making choices, to be able to converse with them on the choices they're making and still be influential? Making their own choice, there's no such thing as making your own choice. You are always following someone else's ideas.
So what would the advice that you would give any parent starting out saying, I want to classically educate my family, I want my children, what advice would you give them? Say, here, do this one or two things. This is the most important thing I can leave you with.
There really are a lot of things, but you can't do them all at once. I would say build your own reading vocabulary. And if you're not good at reading difficult things, start with the Newbery literature for children and the Caldecott picture books for children. Read those voraciously, and you'll start to discover you get faster at that. And then the next level books get easier. So, and I would recommend 3 books. I'm glad you asked this because I keep getting asked similar questions, and now I've come up with my standard answer. If there's 3 books on education that I think are the most honest and comprehensive on education as a whole, it would be to read Amos Fortune Freeman by Jean Lee Latham, which is it's a biography about a true story, though. To read Frederick Douglass's, his autobiography, and to read Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. All 3 of them, those books, speak to education from a totally different angle, but combined to hear 3 people who are so oppressed in their cultures rise so high because of classical education. Really is just life-changing. And what I like doing is, instead of recommending, the higher level ancients, is for parents to say, stick to American literature that's super good, because it was all based on classical ideas if it was written before the 1950s. So you're going to get the classics in a different way, and it's going to be a lot more approachable. And that's another thing that's different about classical conversations. A lot of classical schools start off in 9th grade with the ancients and then head towards modern times because they try to stick chronologically. And to me, the classical model is about the art of learning. And so if you start with grammar and you're building up your words, you start with what you know. And so we start with American history and American literature because that's familiar to our parents. It's not intimidating.
Right.
It's not scary. And so then we go on to British, which is the next familiar to them. And then we go to Shakespeare, and then we go to the ancients, because the classical model is really a method, not the content. And it's a way to just, like we said earlier, to discern. And so ninth graders can appreciate stories about American history much more than they can about Greek history because they haven't been to Greece yet.
Right.
And so starting with what you know.
I'm curious, Chris and Tobin, is your answer to that too? If you had to give advice to a family who's starting out homeschooling based on your experience growing up in the program, Chris, what would you say?
Attend a parent practicum.
Ooh, yeah.
They're free, and they're hours and hours of seminars, and you're going to learn so much.
Today is the day we were plugging that, but it's absolutely true.
Yeah, exactly. But seriously, go to a practicum.
Yeah, that's where I first
It's free.
Understood. I got it about what CC was about. And that's if you leave, you go to one of those and you leave and you go, oh, I understand it, and I see examples of other parents who've been doing it, and I hear testimonials, and I can do this.
Power through the second day. The third day. The third day is the least well attended. But the people who are there, I often go to a practicum and shoot video all 3 days, and I can see the change on people's faces by the third day of the fears and the worries just dropping away. Not dropping away. They now have tools to combat those fears and worries, right?
Yeah.
Well, what's happening is the same thing. The classical model is affecting them, and they're not being patient. So the first day is grammar. You're just hearing all this words, and there's so much of it, and you can't memorize all of it in that day. It's just too much. Yeah. Then you go to sleep. So you die and you're resurrected, and the mercies are new. And the second day, it's like, okay, I got this idea. Let me go ask questions about it and get some clarity on it. And sometimes you don't like the answer, because this is such a new model. And so if you don't expect to go to bed that night and pray and sleep on your questions and these weird answers you're getting, you don't come back to third day. It's too overwhelming. We're not really good at taking notes. We're not really good at skimming. We're not really good at outlining. And basically, if you're at a long seminar with lots of ideas and words, you got to learn how to do that. And so what you're seeing, I think, is that phenomenon is that the third day, the people are just so hungry. They don't care how confused they are, or they were so good at sorting that they want more. It all worked. They can say it.
Right.
So
Jeremiah, so bouncing back at you, what advice would you give to someone that wants to classically educate their children?
Man, I would say based on everything you guys have brought up about the pitfalls of potential pitfalls of classical education and everything, maybe these are the things that you're going to see in your parents or see in your kids. I would say read the book of Proverbs. I think as Proverbs goes again and again, it says, in the multitude of counselors, there's wisdom, challenge, ask a lot of questions, but also there's humility, so humble yourself. And this is, God draws up those who humble themselves before him, so that if Proverbs gets in you with the classical education, then you recognize that would destroy that sort of elitism that can maybe be a danger of saying, here, my way of education is better, or my mindset is better because I've thoroughly researched and you're just, reporting what you've heard the talking heads say, so I would say if you teach them all the benefits, the 5 canons of rhetoric, you walk them through the trivium, but you also, if they have a healthy foundation in the book of Proverbs, I think that provides the balance that I think most people need.
That's a good book. So I didn't go yet. Advice to start homeschooling. I feel like the best advice for you to begin homeschooling is to don't school them for a month. If you're pulling them out. If you're pulling them out.
Oh yeah, at least a month. Yeah.
Wait a month or more.
Let them detox.
Ask them about grass. Ask them about trees. If we're talking about a small child, right. Ask them the questions that are appropriate to their age to get them thinking. In the homeschooling world, there's this movement called unschooling. I think it's good to unschool sometimes Certainly for a 3-year-old, we unschool all the time. If you're just pulling a child out of kindergarten or first grade, unschool for a while, because then you'll sync up with them and get comfortable asking them questions, sparking thoughts.
I would say, again, back to classical conversations, I don't think there's anything wrong with unschooling. That's why we only meet 30 weeks a year in high school, because I want 22 weeks to do whatever we want to do and just live life and not worry about, what someone else is thinking. With saying that, though, I very much believe that reading and doing math is something you want to do throughout the summer. It doesn't have to be about 10 minutes each, but just because they're children growing and you don't want them to lose those skills. And that could be just a silly old Walmart workbook in the car would be plenty, for that. Because we're in the car a lot during the summer because we're going and just enjoying everything.
That's good.
Yeah, 30 weeks of rigor is enough for anybody.
Right. Wrap us up.
Okay, what?
You want to wrap us up?
Yeah. How do I normally wrap us up? I don't know.
Plug Practicum again. And
okay, let me plug the Practicums again. And what else, Chris?
Scion, it's off. Yeah.
Okay, you guys, anything else to say?
So I had a point about the video that came out today. It'll be yesterday when you're hearing this. I don't remember what the point was.
Well, watch it. What's it called?
Just go. Communication. Classical tools of communication, because we're talking about communicating being a matter of meeting people where they are instead of dousing them with your knowledge. And I did a video about that, as if I'm qualified to talk about it, but it was a lesson that I learned while shooting a video with Chris and John Mark, one of our other workers in the office. So I made a video about it. It came out yesterday. Next week, there's going to be a video about the canon of memoria, understanding why we memorize things instead of just looking them up. Because, of course, there are things you can look up, but there are things you can't look up, and you need to practice with the things that you can so that you're good at memorizing the things that you can't.
And with that, we're off.